I never imagined that a seemingly ordinary job would change my life forever. I still wonder if I should share this story, but I feel like I need to warn other people about what happened in that damn store. It all started 3 months ago when I got a job as a night attendant at the Noite Dia supermarket in the west of the city. The interview was strangely quick. The manager, Mr. Martinez, seemed more concerned about filling the position than actually evaluating my qualifications. "We urgently need someone for the night shift," he said, avoiding my gaze. The last employee, well, he left without notice. I noticed a slight tremor in his hands as he signed my contract. My first day would be the following Monday. I arrived at 10 p.m. as agreed and was greeted by Carlos, the employee from the previous shift. He seemed nervous and anxious to leave. While he quickly showed me the basic procedures, his explanations were rushed and confusing. "The cameras sometimes fail," he mentioned, "but it's normal, I guess. Just don't pay too much attention to noises after midnight. It's probably the cooling system." Before leaving, Carlos hesitated at the door. "Oh, and one more thing," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "If you hear someone calling you by name, ignore it, even if it sounds familiar. Especially if it sounds familiar." He practically ran away, leaving me alone in the huge supermarket. The first few hours were peaceful, although the silence was oppressive. The fluorescent lights buzzed above my head, creating unsettling shadows between the shelves. It was around 11:30 p.m. that I noticed something strange for the first time. The automatic door to the main entrance opened, as if someone was coming in, but there was no one there. Cold night air rushed in, bringing with it a sweet, sickening smell that I had never smelled before. Checking the security cameras, I noticed that the door had opened on its own on 3 other occasions that night, each time with no one in sight. That's when I started to understand why so many employees had left this job. There was something wrong here, something that went far beyond a simple faulty door. And that would be just the first of many disturbing nights to come. After that first incident with the door, I tried to convince myself that it was just a faulty sensor. But then the whispers started. First, they were so quiet that I thought it was just the noise of the air conditioning. However, gradually they became clearer, more distinct. Voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. I decided to make the rounds of the store, holding tight to my radio communicator. Not that there was anyone to answer me on the other side. Cleaning products aisle was especially cold that night. The bleach bottles seemed to reflect a light of their own, a sickly glow that didn't come from the fluorescent lights above. That's when I noticed something disturbing. The security cameras were rotating on their own, following my movements. It wasn't the programmed automatic movement, it was something more intentional, as if someone was watching me through them. When it stopped, they stopped. When I moved, they followed. The worst happened when I got to the drinks section. All the glass bottles began to vibrate simultaneously, producing a high-pitched, rising sound that reverberated throughout the store. The noise was deafening, and I could feel my chest vibrate from the frequency. Suddenly, a crystal-clear voice cut through the noise. "Maria," my name, pronounced in a way that chilled me to the bone. It was my grandmother's voice, who had passed away 3 years ago. I ran back to the security office, my heart beating so hard I thought it would explode. Cameras continued to follow me, and now I could swear I saw shadows moving in my peripheral vision. Shadows that appeared to be human in shape, but were too elongated, too distorted to be natural. When I finally reached the office, I locked the door and threw myself into the chair, panting. It was then that I noticed something on the monitor that showed the hallway I had just left. A figure was standing there, completely still. She was tall, too tall, and wore what looked like an old uniform from the store, but it was all torn and stained with something dark. The figure had its back to the camera, but slowly began to turn its head at an angle impossible for any human being. I couldn't look away from the monitor as that figure continued to turn its head unnaturally. When I finally completed the 180-degree turn, I felt my blood freeze. Where there should have been a face, there was only a dark, shapeless mass, with something that resembled a mouth, gaping in a grotesque smile that extended beyond the possible limits of a human face. But the worst part wasn't its appearance, it was the fact that, even through the monitor screen, I could feel that thing was watching me. It was as if his non-existent eyes penetrated directly into my soul. Suddenly, the being began to move erratically, as if it were being manipulated by invisible strings. His movements were jerky and uncoordinated, but still, he advanced toward the office where I was. The radio communicator on my desk started emitting static, and through the noise I could hear distorted voices, dozens of them all talking at once. Some appeared to be crying, others screaming, and some were laughing. Amidst the cacophony, I recognized a voice. "Maria, you shouldn't have come to work here." It was the voice of Carlos, the employee who had trained me. But there was something wrong with it. It seemed to be mixed with other voices, as if several people were trying to speak through it at the same time. The being in the hallway was getting closer and closer, and now I could hear its movements even without the aid of the cameras, a wet, slimy sound of something being dragged across the floor. The sweet, putrid smell I had smelled before was stronger, so intense that I began to feel nauseous. I quickly glanced at the other screens, looking for an escape route, and that's when I realized there were more of them. In every aisle, on every corner of the store, there were similar figures, all moving in the same disturbing way, all coming toward me. Some crawled across the ceiling, others emerged from the shelves themselves, distorting the reality around them like an image in a molten mirror. And then, all the monitor screens went black simultaneously, except for one message that appeared in red letters. "Welcome to the night shift, Maria. You're never leaving again." My hands were shaking as I tried to call desperately to the police, but the phone only emitted the same disturbing static. The office lights began to flicker, dimmer and dimmer, until I found myself plunged into almost total darkness. The only illumination came from the sickly glow of the now-off monitors, which emitted a pulsating greenish light. The sound of scratching on the office door made me catch my breath. These weren't normal scratches, it felt like dozens of nails were scraping the metal in different directions, creating a macabre symphony that reverberated throughout the room. The putrid smell was unbearable now, and I could see a dark, slimy substance beginning to ooze from under the door. Through the frosted glass that overlooked the hallway, I saw silhouettes huddling together. They were distorted human forms, some with extra limbs, others with impossibly long necks, all contorting in ways that defied the laws of anatomy. In the midst of my panic, I realized that I could identify details in their torn clothes. They were old uniforms from the store, from different eras. It was then that I found, hidden in a drawer, an old diary. The yellowed pages contained records of previous employees, all reporting similar experiences. The last entry was from just 3 days ago, written by Carlos. They were employees like us. Something happened here, something terrible. The store, it feeds on us, changes us. And now it's too late to escape. The glass began to crack under the pressure of the creatures on the other side. Each fissure that formed emitted a sharp sound, like a distant scream. Through the broken glass, a smell of decomposition and chemicals permeated the room. One of the creatures stuck what must have been its hand through one of the cracks. It was a shapeless mass of fingers, all moving independently, feeling their way through the air towards me. The monitors suddenly came back to life, but now they only showed static. Amid the noise, faces began to appear, faces of people I recognized from the store's old employee files. Everyone looking at me, their expressions frozen in eternal terror. The glass finally gave way with a deafening crash. The freezing air that invaded the office carried with it the whispers of hundreds of voices. I cowered in the far corner, watching in horror as the creatures poured into the room as a single pulsating mass of limbs and distorted forms. It was then that I noticed something even more disturbing. As they got closer, their shapes began to become clearer under the greenish light of the monitors. I was able to recognize individual features: a wristwatch that belonged to Carlos, a necklace I had seen in the photo of a former employee on the mural, scars and tattoos that matched descriptions in the missing employee files. The radio communicator came to life with a high-pitched hiss. A voice unlike any other emerged from the static. "Have you noticed that there is no emergency exit in this store, Maria?" The voice was right. In all my training, in all the plants I had seen, I had never noticed this crucial detail. Creatures stopped their advance, forming a semicircle around me. In the center of them, a figure began to materialize. It was Mr. Martinez, the manager who had hired me. But there was something deeply wrong with him. His skin seemed translucent, and through it I could see shadows moving, as if his body were just a shell for something much older and more terrible. "Do you know why we always only hire for the night shift, Maria?" His voice sounded distant and close at the same time, as if it were coming from several directions. "Because the store needs to feed. It's hungry, so hungry. And we're just its servants now." As he spoke, I noticed that the shadows on the walls began to gain depth, as if space itself was distorting. The floor beneath my feet seemed to pulse, as if the entire structure of the store was a living organism, breathing, waiting. I tried to get closer to the door, but my feet felt glued to the floor. Looking down, I realized in horror that it wasn't an illusion. The floor was literally merging with my shoes, as if it were made of some slimy, living material. Mr. Martinez continued approaching, his form increasingly unstable, like a painting being melted. "Every employee that has come through here is a part of it now." He gestured to the pulsing walls. "Some resisted at first, like you are doing now. Others tried to run away. But the store, it always brings them back. Always." The fluorescent lights above began to pop one by one, but instead of darkness, each broken bulb released a phosphorescent substance that floated into the air like luminous dust. The air became thick, almost liquid, and each breath became more difficult than the last. It was then that I saw something moving inside the metal shelves, not on them, but inside the metal itself. Faces formed on the surface, as if they were trying to emerge. Faces I recognized from the missing employee files. Their mouths moved silently, as if trying to warn me of something. Mr. Martinez was now just a few steps away. His skin had become completely transparent, revealing not bones or organs, but a restless mass of shadows and distorted memories. "You know what's most fascinating, Maria? The way the store chooses its prey. It doesn't take just anyone, it selects carefully. And you're perfect." Creatures around me began to make a low, rhythmic sound, like an ancient chant in a language I didn't know but somehow felt familiar. The floor continued to rise past my feet, now reaching my ankles, and I could feel not only the cold of the material, but also pulsations, like heartbeats coming from deep within the structure itself. The walls began to bleed a black substance that rose toward the ceiling, defying gravity. The liquid formed complex patterns that reminded me of ancient inscriptions. The more I looked at them, the more sense they seemed to make, as if they were telling the story of the store, a story much older and darker than I could have imagined. "Before it was a store," Mr. Martinez continued, his voice now mixing with dozens of others, "this place was different. People of the ancient city knew. They built a temple here, trying to contain something that it was here long before them. But it didn't work. Nothing works against her." My mind was starting to get foggy. The voices of the other employees now echoed directly in my head, sharing their memories, their fears, their last moments of consciousness before being absorbed by the entity that inhabited the store. I saw flashes of other nights like this, other employees in my position, each of them eventually succumbing to the will of the store. The slimy material had already reached my knees, and every inch of skin it touched began to tingle and numb. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The air had become too thick. The shadows on the walls began to cast themselves toward me, taking on shapes that the human mind shouldn't be able to comprehend. "Don't fight," whispered a voice I recognized as Carlos's. "It's easier when you accept it. When you become part of it, you understand everything. Her loneliness, her eternal hunger. And then you start to feel hungry too." The ceiling above began to curve downward, as if the entire structure of the store was folding in on itself, creating a cocoon around me. Creatures that were once my coworkers moved even closer, their bodies melting into each other, forming a perfect circle of flesh and distorted shadows. It was at that moment that something inside me changed. The memories that flooded my mind were no longer just terrors. I began to see other things. I saw the true nature of the entity that inhabited the store. It wasn't just hunger or evil, it was loneliness. A loneliness as old as time itself, of a creature that existed before this planet was even formed. The substance now reached my waist, but the fear was beginning to give way to a strange fascination. Each person she had absorbed became part of a larger consciousness, an infinite web of memories and experiences. Through the eyes of others, I saw the full story. How the entity had gotten here, how the ancients had tried to imprison it, how it had transformed its prison into a place of power. "Now you begin to understand," said Mr. Martinez, his manner increasingly elusive. "We are not victims, Maria. We are chosen. Each of us was selected because we have something she needs. Something that helps her understand humanity." The voices in my head were clearer now. They weren't screams of terror, they were calls of welcome. Each absorbed employee had become part of something bigger, something eternal. The loneliness we all felt in life was gone, replaced by a deep and impossible connection. The air around me began to sparkle with tiny points of light, like stars trapped inside the store. Point was a memory, a life, a story. I saw families, loves, losses, joys, all human experiences preserved eternally in the collective consciousness of the entity. My legs no longer existed as a physical form. They had become part of the very fabric of the store.
And so we come to the end of this dark story. Or is we really coming? Because now, while you watch this video, be aware of you. These stories are not always on the screen. Sometimes they find a way of us follow to enter our minds. So if you hear a strange sound, if you notice an unexpected shadow or feel that invisible presence by your side, remember, it may just be your imagination, or maybe you have awakened something you shouldn't. If you have the courage, subscribe to the Portal of Horror to explore more dark mysteries. See you next time. Until there, and be careful what may be watching you.